Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee LaValle McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer. And today I want to talk about the inner critic and the processes of negative energy extraction, the Buddhist Chöd process of transforming demons into allies, and depossession. Depossession is a word I don't use very much because it conjures images of Linda Blair from the 1970s movies The Exorcist, with her head spinning around, puking green pea soup, and throwing furniture against the wall. I'm way too sensitive with sound and vision to actually see movies like that, but I did read the book, which I often do when I'm interested in the subject but can't tolerate the cinematic version. Depossession, also known as exorcism, is a really ancient practice for removing negative energy or evil, which people don't like that word. I prefer the term intentional negativity, and we all have intentional negativity. And one of the most common places I see intentional negativity is in people's own internal critic. Most people have some kind of self-judgment, internal criticism, or even self-hatred that is a constant part of their life. For some people, this internal judgment might be a protective voice that helps keep them in line. For others, it might be an annoyance that they have to deal with or something that they just try to ignore. Lots of people live with an internal oppressor that constantly tells them they're not good enough, they're unworthy, unlovable. Some people suffer with chronic guilt and shame. Others have a fearful, overprotective inner judge that renders them unable to take healthy risks or be emotionally vulnerable. Tragically, there are also those who suffer with an internal critic so harsh that it can drive them to suicidal despair. In spiritual psychology, it's understood that nothing can live in our psychic space without our permission. And using a modified, updated version of this ancient practice of depossession, we can learn to work with our inner critic in a safe way to either modify or update it into a more helpful device, or perhaps even dissolve it completely. The famous psychologist Sigmund Freud called our inner critic the superego and believed that it was the result of parental punishment and reward for behavior. Most kids seek the approval of their caregivers. They try to suppress what they get punished for and internalize the ideas, beliefs, and behaviors of their family and culture. This internalization serves us as children by enabling us to survive or even thrive while we're growing up. Freud believed that the superego is the seat of moral and ethical reasoning, what we might call the conscience. Usually our beliefs about what's right and wrong we hand down to our children without question. And then the work of becoming a full grown-up often involves questioning these hand-me-down ideas to see if they actually resonate with our authentic self. This questioning can be a challenging and even frightening process, but the rewards are really important. We get emotional balance, mental clarity, and personal spiritual fulfillment. Life is not one size fits all, and we're all here to make our own unique contribution to the world. And we can only do this if we are free to speak and act from the truth of our own hearts and minds. So what Freud called the superego, I call the inner critic. And in my experience, the inner critic is often a survival mechanism or a protective device that was actually helpful at some point in life. Unfortunately, once a protective device is established, most people don't realize that they can choose to release it and be free from this conditioned self-criticism. It's kind of like setting up a governmental agency, and then over time it becomes useless, but over time it develops its own life force and justifies its own existence, and it's really hard to dismantle. But as adults, part of our good self-care is keeping our house in order. We want to arrange our living space so it's organized and enjoyable. It's important to get rid of broken appliances and clothing that doesn't fit. The same's true for our psyche. So, for example, rather than tolerating the inner critic, like some bad resident in our house, some mean aunt that lives upstairs that we feel obligated to take care of, we can actually ask her to move out. But it's important to understand our relationship with our inner critic and why we've allowed it into our life in the first place. Then we can decide if it actually serves us today, and if not, we can get rid of it. So people are often skeptical if it's possible to let go of something that's been with them for years or even decades, and the answer is a resounding yes. The psyche is incredibly plastic and adaptable, we have as much responsibility to update our inner systems as we do to update our phone or laptop. And it's actually a very similar process. Bill Gates released Windows 1 in 1983, and it was revolutionary at the time. And if you tried to run anything on it today, it would not work. And yet many of us have really old systems that were put in place ages ago, and they may have even helped us survive the circumstances we were in, but they no longer serve them, yet they're still part of our internal operating system. At some point, with almost every client that I work with, we move through the transforming demons into allies process. I'll leave a link to a recording of this process in the show notes, and you can actually do this for yourself. And once people move through this process, most of them are completely and permanently free of their inner critic. I know my own internal self-criticism was such that no matter how my day was going, no matter what I'd accomplished, there was always this knockdown voice to remind me of all the things that I'd done wrong in my life. My inner critic told me how fat my thighs were, how loud my voice was, and reminded me of all the little things I did imperfectly every day. I was never good enough. Nothing was ever acceptable to that voice inside me. It was a relentless perfectionist. And God forbid I ever made a genuine human mistake. The ongoing tirade of self-abuse literally drove me to drink to drown it out and gain some temporary relief. If anybody ever talked to me the way that critical voice in my head talked to me, I would punch him in the mouth. And I'm deeply grateful to report that I have been completely free of that voice for over 25 years, and it's never come back. Now, dissolving the inner critic uncovered other layers of how I felt about myself, layers that also needed work. That critical self-hating voice can definitely be released or transformed into something that's more constructive. In fact, I did this process yesterday with a client. He's really working on integrating his inner wisdom and intuition with his intellect. And there's this voice in his head that just has nothing but relentless criticism and negative things to say. And it was really blocking this kind of integration and trust of his own inner wisdom. And so in spiritual psychology, we use what I call the active imagination to give form to the non-rational, non-physical aspects of the self. And the advantage of that is that once something has a form, we can work with it directly in really powerful ways. And the process that I call transforming the inner critic into an ally is based on a really ancient Buddhist practice called Chöd, and particularly on the work of an 11th century female yogini named Mache Glabdrong. And she brought a real feminine spin to this idea of exorcism or depossession. This really potent practice has been updated and popularized by Llama Tsultrim Allione. She's a modern Buddhist teacher and the founder of Tara Mandala, which is a spiritual center in Colorado. And she calls this practice feeding your demons. And I feel really fortunate that I've had the opportunity to express my gratitude to Llama Tsultrim Allione directly for this incredible process. I personally was trained in some traditional shamanic practices, of which exorcism and depossession is a part. They're really powerful practices for working with internal negativity and a lot of psychological issues. In ancient shamanism, they use these practices for all kinds of healing, including physical healing, where looking at illness was seen as a spirit. And there's actually more power and validity to that you might think, but that's a whole other conversation. But the problem with working with exorcism and depossession in this traditional, really kind of masculine, almost violent way is that it's kind of dangerous. And if you ever saw the movie The Exorcist, at the end of the movie, the priest gets the possessing demon out of Linda Blair, and it possesses him and gets him to kill himself. Not a good idea if you want to sustain yourself as a therapist. And distilling out negativity is kind of a funky process because energy needs to move, and where does that negativity move to? And if you've ever been pissed off and took it out unnecessarily on somebody else, I just bitched out my son the other night because I was mad about something else, you're actually passing negativity to that other person. You can frequently track it from one person to another person to another person, that we can pass negativity like energy running on a wire. We live in a culture that really values scientific materialism, and anything that you can't see or replicate in a laboratory is kind of considered to be untrue. And there's a lot of limitations to that. And I think some of those limitations are catching up with us right now in the larger world difficulties that we're having. And if you're interested in bringing more light into the world and finding positive solutions, looking within ourselves first and doing our own work is some of the best contribution we can make. So the Catholic Church still does depossessions and exorcisms. I don't know who's trained in doing them. And if they're done anything like they were in that movie, it's a really low level and ignorant way to do it. Really based on a lot of fear. And it's actually kind of dangerous and not terribly effective. So I was thrilled when I found the Feeding Your Demons process because it's rooted in compassion and it actually heals everybody and every energy involved in the situation, including the negativity itself. It's brilliant. And it's probably worth telling the story of Macha Glabdrang, this 11th century female yogini. So she's an enlightened being and she's having this enlightenment experience. And I don't know if her clothes burn off or she just takes them off and she's naked and she levitates up into this tree in her ecstatic communion with the divine. She's just emanating love and joy and light and all beautiful things, feminine and sexual and creative, and she's amazing. Love her. So she goes up into this tree, and in many Eastern traditions, it's understood that everything has a life force, everything has a spirit. They recognized certainly that there were currents of constructive and destructive energy flowing all over the place. We can feel that today. And I'm going to tell you, when you make them concrete, it gives you a lot more options than when you just feel powerless over them. So there were these nature spirits, I think they were the Nagals, and they were mad that she was up in the tree in all her nakedness. I think they thought they owned the tree. And so they gathered together and they came up to attack her. Hey, get out of our tree. Who do you think you are? And she was so filled with love and generosity and the oneness of the universe that she could see their suffering. She could see their selfishness and their anger and their ignorance. And she dissolved herself into a nectar that was exactly the quality of compassion and care and safety and fulfillment that they most deeply needed. She fed herself to them for their own healing, and they drank this amazing nectar and they were healed. Their anger dissolved. Experiencing this kind of selfless generosity evolved their ignorance into awe and awareness. This incredible generosity transformed their selfishness, and they were healed. And as she came back into herself, these transformed demons dedicated themselves to being her allies and assisting her in bringing her glorious and amazing feminine power of love and compassion and generosity into the world. And this is the basis of the Feeding Your Demons process. When we bring compassion into our own deepest needs that are often twisted into anger and ignorance and suffering, we can transform that energy directly. It's really powerful. I hope you'll take the time to do the inner journey that's linked into the show notes. It can really change your life. So I'll tell you a little bit about my client yesterday. So we go into this inner voice in his body that just has nothing nice to say. And it comes out as kind of this like really grumpy little angry man. And then we go to the place. When was the first time he experienced that? And he was 6 years old and he wanted to fit in with his friends. And he was feeling like he was weird and unworthy and unlikable. This inner critic developed or came, however you want to understand it, to help him modify himself, to tell him to shut up when he was talking too long. It was basically to try to get him to be more cool. Because 6-year-olds need to be very cool. You know, it probably worked. It's a protective device. It's a defensive structure. It was like an inner filter that he didn't have for himself to try to help him be socially successful. Very common dynamic with the inner critic. But you know, now he's a successful business owner. He's a world traveler. He's a interesting, highly evolved, deeply emotional, relational person who wants to bring himself into the world in this more full way. And he's got this stupid voice that's been there for 30 years, still telling him to shut up. But just recognizing that it's there isn't actually enough to extract it or change it. So the awesome thing about, again, giving things form in our active imagination is that we can actually ask the inner critic questions. So the first question was, what do you want? And really what it wants now is its own survival. It actually feeds on negativity, and it creates the negativity that it feeds on. By shaming and blaming and criticizing, it actually creates this inner negativity, and that's actually like food for it. The inner critic is generally an energetic parasite or an emotional parasite, feeding on inner negativity and self-perpetuating, again, like some bad governmental agency that we don't need anymore. No offense to any civil servants out there. And so although the original intention of this formation is self-protection of the host, over time, it just becomes involved in its own self-protection. It's actually the shadow side of the life force. Everything's impermanent, and there's always a time for things to die or dissolve. And we're often super resistant to that. And when things outlive their useful function, they become pathological. And that's true across our life, individually, collectively, systemically. We need to always be willing to grow and evolve, and that includes letting things go, letting things die and dissolve, so that new, more effective structures and systems can take their place. So when my client asks what the inner critic really needs, what's its most authentic and vulnerable need driving this negativity, what it really needs is validation and reassurance, which is just what this little boy needed at the time that this protective device developed itself. And so, using the transforming demons into allies process, we generate this nectar or elixir that's exactly the quality of reassurance and validation that's most deeply needed. And we feed it to this demon, to this inner critic. And the inner critic dissolves completely. And then we ask for an ally or a helper to appear. This is the spiritual or transpersonal aspect of this work that I find just incredible. And so what comes, this is the update, this is the new iOS, the new operating system, is this wise being that's totally connected to intuition, but has a sharp, critical, rational mind, and is totally engaged in integrating the mind and the body, the intellectual and the intuitive, the rational and the non-rational, so that he has access to his own inner wisdom and doesn't have to go through this old protective device that doesn't trust who he really is anymore. And once you do this process, very similar to turning a cucumber into a pickle, it's irreversible in my experience. Just like when you update your phone. Although some of us wish we could actually go back to the pre-update, because more than once I've had an update I didn't like. I actually haven't had an experience with a client who didn't like the Transforming Demons into Allies update. I'm going to end with a really powerful story that I highlight in my book, Allies and Demons, Working with Spirit for Power and Healing. So this guy, Jim, he was a computer programmer in his 50s. He had been suicidal most of his life. He was plagued with insomnia, and he had to sleep with the television on to drown out the voices in his head. Over time, we worked through lots of layers of inner turmoil, and Jim became free in a way that he never thought was possible. And he had layers of inner critics, but the first inner critic we worked with was by far the most nasty and dangerous. And the energy of Jim's inner critic lived in the back of his head and neck, like a cold, dark entity standing behind him. And when we followed the path of that terrible voice, which told him that he was no good and he should just die, we ended up in a memory of Jim as a toddler in foster care. Jim had lived in foster care for 18 months before his adoptive family found him. And because he was given up by his parents, he had come to believe that he was fundamentally bad. Children have a really limited worldview, and they make sense of their experience as only being related to themselves. You know, when a fetus lives in the mother's womb for 9 months, they become attuned to the sounds of the mother's body and her emotions and her energy. And although they don't have words to describe this, newborns are completely aware of losing this connection with their mother. This is a body-felt experience, which can be really hard to address through talk therapy. Jim's pre-verbal belief that he was bad had permeated his existence. And the inner critic provided a narrative that explained his emotional experience and eventually evolved into this ominous voice that told him that he was worthless and that he should die. And although it was destructive and debilitating, he had a really surprising attachment to it. Tragically, this inner demon, who he came to call the Dark One, was also like a companion for him. It was like an abusive friend who promised never to leave him so he would never have to be alone. It actually kept him company in his abandonment and loneliness. In fact, it was the only relationship that had felt consistent through his entire life. So Jim struggled a lot with making spiritual connection. In fact, this inner voice interrupted more than one attempt at connection with a spiritual ally. And after one particularly discouraging session, I felt this really strong presence enter the room. And I asked Jim to drop into his body and see if he felt like there was something at his feet. And this big burly man burst into tears. And he said, "It's Lucky, my dog. She died when I was 12. She's the only thing I believe really loved me in my life." And we began to work with the spirit of Lucky and the little boy who was left in foster care. And as this dark companion dissolved during the Transforming Your Demons into Allies process, Jim expressed his gratitude to it and wished it well. And the dark energy became replaced by a grounded, compassionate oak tree with deep roots and spreading branches, which loved and supported Jim's inner child. And although there were lots of other issues to work through, Jim reported that his suicidal thoughts, which had plagued him since childhood, never returned. Ultimately, he was able to deepen his relationship with his adoptive family. He eventually even hired a private investigator to find his birth family, which was a really healing experience for him. So if you have an inner critic that tells you you're worthless, tells you what you do isn't good enough, lists all the things you haven't accomplished, all the reasons you shouldn't feel peaceful and self-satisfied, or perhaps one that even tells you you are worthless and a bad person and you don't deserve to be here anymore. If you wonder if you can actually get rid of that or change it into something more positive, the answer is yes. We are here to grow and evolve and bring what's best about us into the world. Freeing ourselves of our inner critic can be part of our path in expressing who we really are in the world. And we're all needed right now, more than ever. So this is my gift to you. Click the link in the show notes if you want to update your internal operating system. Thank you for listening. If you've liked this podcast, please subscribe. If you want to get a copy of my book, it's available on my website, reneemckenna.com, or you can search Allies and Demons on Amazon. Blessings on your path. Until we meet again.